Thank you very much for that speech. Just as another point of order, points of information should be kept brief, phrases of question, and constructive to the argument, as exhibited by students over there and over there. Finally, we move on to the final speaker of the opposition, Shifra Moriarty. Shifra is an MPhil student at Girton College studying criminology. You have the ears of the House.
Good evening. I'd like you to consider 3 questions. Would we be having this debate in a failed democracy? Would we have the freedom to criticize and condemn our government as we have here? Would you be able to vote on this motion tonight freely, free to choose without fear of reprisal or repercussion? These are all rights which we see protected by our British democracy. The proposition have raised some important points about first past the post and low voter turnout, which I promise to address. But our democracy is so much more than a means of establishing governance. It is a system, flawed, yes, but successful. Successful in upholding democratic institutions and values, like the rule of law, protection of rights, and freedom of the press. And personally, having successfully brought criminal defense and appeal cases, I've seen firsthand the mechanisms in place to protect our democratic rights. I've had clients wrongfully accused, proven innocent, who've had their rights protected and their belief in democracy upheld due to the rule of law. So what is it? The rule of law is the ability for the courts to speak truth to power, and our constitutional history is littered with examples. Like in 2019, when Boris Johnson attempted to silence political opposition and prorogue Parliament in pushing through a Brexit bill which didn't have the support of the people, and the courts said no. Democracy has been tested and has prevailed. What else does the rule of law mean? Well, it means that we are equal beyond the law. As Lord Denning said, "Be you never so high that the law is above you." This is a quintessentially British approach and vital in our protection of rights. That quote is taken from the 18th century. It was used in the 70s by Denning in a judgment against the then Attorney General, and it's just as applicable now. Consider Partygate in 2022, when our government was investigated by the police and an independent panel who delivered a clear and transparent judgment that you can print out and read, that suspended him from office. But it doesn't just mean that we can hold those who govern us to account. We can use the rule of law to protect our everyday rights through mechanisms such as our jury system. We're judged by our peers, the open courts, open cases, our right of appeal 1, 2, 3 times by different bodies to ensure that our rights have been upheld.
It strikes me that judicial due process, whilst good, is not necessarily democracy. Sometimes the democratically elected will of the people will run up against the judicial system in explosive ways. Sometimes the judiciary is in the wrong, say, for example, the many US Supreme Court decisions against the democratic will of the US people. What do you do if the judicial safeguards are actually hurting democracy?
Well, as I'll get on to the end point, the whole idea is that these institutions can work together so they can, in a sense, mitigate when one of them falls down. As we've seen with the postmasters scandal. So, for example, when the Free Press, who drew attention to a failure of the court, then it's the law and the courts who are working together to right that wrong. Our rule of law does not just hold those who govern us to account. We use them to protect our everyday rights, like the jury system, open courts, and our right of appeal. And I'm sure the new law students amongst us are discovering the joys of Westlaw. Our cases, our courts are open to the people to ensure transparency. Transparency is built into our democracy, even by comparison to other democracies, like the US. Just 1 second. They still don't know who assassinated their president 70 years ago. We know who buys Keir Starmer's underpants. Transparency in decision-making protects us, along with a separation of powers. Compare this even to contemporary democracies like France, with its potential for a state-appointed person to take on different roles, such as investigator, jury, and adjudicator. Would you put your liberty in the hands of just one person, a stranger? No, because people fail. They err in judgment. They can be conflicted with their own bias and prejudice. Which is why the institutions of British democracy can expose these and shield us from them.
Isn't it the case that the propositions talk about the evils of the British system being based on tension and not having questions, not having the executive having too much power? But the proof of the British system's strength is that the opposition has one job and one job only, which is to question the executive. And that is Mr. Bowie, MP's entire job right now is holding the government to account. Isn't that a strength of the system?
Are you making my point for me? Thank you very much. Here we separate out these roles and during trials and review every decision. And how else is our democracy protected? Through our media. Media, as you've correctly said, is very powerful, but not in its power to influence politicians, in its power to influence the people, because they hold the power in democracy. Going to finish this point first. Consider the Panama Papers, the MP expenses scandal, or the Postmasters scandal. It was our free media, our British journalists who brought us the stories of hundreds of postmasters wrongfully prosecuted. And it was our courts and our law who worked together to right this wrong. So I invite you to recognize how these institutions work in tandem, how the rule of law, protection of rights, and free media work together to successfully deliver our democracy. I promise to address some of the issues raised by the proposition, and I will do so now. Starting with the electoral system. I agree and fully recognize the merits of alternate vote systems, but I would remind the proposition that we held a referendum on changing the vote system, and the British people rejected it. So it's inherently contradictory to advocate for a more representative system while ignoring...
The referendum had a turnout of, I believe, less than 35%, and it was based...
It was democratic choice not to turn out.
Think tanks have proved that the British public do want a more proportional system.
There's nothing that is more direct assessment of the public will than a referendum. And I'd proposition you this: if we had voted in favour of it, do you have the belief that we would have agreed with that and we would have actually changed it? I believe we do. We would have accepted the result of a referendum and we would have changed our system, because that's a democracy. Oh, can I please make more progress? So it's inherently contradictory to advocate for this, because a referendum is the most clear way, direct way of assessing the will of the people. Furthermore, our system does allow for radical and efficient changes in government, as we saw this summer. Compare this to, as we've mentioned, the proportional representative countries like Belgium, whose government has been suspended for 2 years while its parties have failed to form a coalition. Yes.
Would you call Brexit radical and efficient?
What, the vote or the process? Our ability to have a referendum on it. I think it was a radical decision to make, and I think that the way that it has been put into action has been very disappointing for everyone involved. Yeah.
Let's jump in answer to that point. That we had that referendum, then we implemented the will of the British people, shows that British democracy is indeed alive and well and is functioning.
Fine. No, I love people making my point for me. Proportionality in elections doesn't necessarily equate to proportionality in governance. And we see this with the system in Germany, when it's often the third or fourth largest party who holds the real balance of power because they decide who to go into a coalition with. We've also mentioned the issue of low voter turnout, and I agree, it is an issue. It's an issue that people do not take advantage of their democratic rights, but this is not a failure of democracy. A decision not to vote is still an exercise of democratic right, your right to choose. Consider Chomsky's take on this. The job of a citizen is to keep their mouths open. His concept that democracy malaise through the public non-engagement, not because it's failed, but often because we take it for granted in this country. Go ahead.
You're quoting Chomsky, but I'm not quite sure that Chomsky would agree with the conclusion you're making from his quote. Because I don't see how a democracy, you're acting like there's a lovely, wonderful democracy on a plate, and people are just choosing not to have it. But actually a democracy where people don't bother participating, that's not really a democracy at all. It's it's probably not a dead democracy, but it's a very hollow, slow, old, decaying democracy in which people can't see any point in engaging.
Which is why we do need to reinstill the confidence of the British people, the belief and the actions which will translate into increased engagement in our democracy, so the democracy doesn't malaise, as he has said. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to carry on. Not because it malaises through public non-engagement, but because we take it for granted. Our generation hasn't known the struggles of a genuine failed democracy. But we can look at democratic protests in Tiananmen Square or Hong Kong in 2020, people dying in the pursuit of democracy. It's unlikely that they would experience the voting apathy that we have here if they'd been granted this fundamental right. And let us consider the riots further for a second. Compare the way the riots were treated here this summer to Hong Kong in 2020. Here, swift and transparent justice in accordance with our law. There, people going missing, tortured, murdered. Here, adequate response from the police. There, police brutality ruled. Here, free and open press coverage. There, media blackouts and cover-ups. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to continue. Those are the realities of a failed democracy. That is not the case here. I don't stand before you appealing to some idealized form of democracy, because that's not the case. We don't have one. It's an inherently flawed system. And with those flaws, each generation have found opportunities to strengthen our democracy. As Churchill has said, democracy is the worst form of government, except for everything else, because what is the alternative? 1 second. Moving forward, we need the belief and the actions.
In India in 1943. So why still...
You don't have to accept this. You can.
I've been told to conclude, so I will do so. Moving forward, we need the belief and the actions of the British people to steer us away from those alternatives. So let's start by doing that tonight, by opposing this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that round of speeches. I will once again remind people, although there will be no continued floor speeches, that it is within the paper speaker's prerogative to accept or decline a point of information. So please do not interrupt them when they're speaking. There's a few notices I say before we sort of go on to the voting. Tomorrow we have a speakers event with Eddie Abu, so that should be good, so do come along to that. Also, over the next few days, we'll be releasing tickets to our winter ball, so keep an eye on our social medias. We're going to have our weekly social in the bar afterwards with free chips, whilst also the results will be announced. There's the opportunity to be a paper speaker, so keep an eye on our social medias for that, and you can audition, just like Harry and Shifra did this evening. The winner of the floor speech prize, which is a free bottle of wine, goes to the gentleman down here in the tie, so congratulations, Tim, for that. Speak to me afterwards, and we'll get that sorted. You can have that whenever. But finally, in this house, we vote with our feet. So at the back of the door, at the room, you'll see ayes, noes, and abstentions down the middle. Please get up on your feet, make your decision, and head to the orator where the results will be announced. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening.